Okay, this is a final video. Just in terms of this video, this is just about discussing some questions students have really struggled with in the past, as well as just talking about some key relationships between the goals. So a couple of things, again, when you're looking at weak and strong labour markets, weak labour markets lead to both less demand pull and cost push inflation. So demand pull inflation goes down because people don't have much money. So there's limited incomes, limited factor incomes, and therefore less spending and less demand pull inflation. And cost push inflation because wages generally go down, because the supply of labour exceeds demand, and also because there is increased productivity. So that stems from the fact that people work harder because they're worried about losing their job. In a strong labour market, there's increased demand pull inflation, more people have got a factor income, and therefore they're spending more. And secondly, cost push inflation increases because wages generally increase because the demand for labour is exceeding supply. Reasons slow wage growth leads to increased employment. So it's a common question that will ask you about, why the wage price index going down at a slow rate, going up at a slow rate might be good for increasing jobs. There's a few reasons for that. One, businesses are likely to be more labour intensive. So when wages are growing up slowly, it's more attractive to hire labour as opposed to capital, and that can help to create employment for a lot of people. The lower costs of production increase firms' willingness to produce, so the supply shifts to the left, and that increases overall levels of supply in the economy. And thirdly, the lower prices boost our international competitiveness. So again, the lower prices from lower wages can create jobs as well because our prices go down and people want to buy our products. And whenever production goes up, we generally need more workers to meet that extra production. As I said to you in class today, the relationship between the goals is something new in the study guide. If you get asked to analyse the relationship between two goals, what that's saying is analyse the relationship both ways. I don't know why I had to spell out analyse, but there you go. So if it's growth and employment, it's the impact of growth on employment, which means that when there's increased growth measured by real GDP, put the word real in there, looks good, an increase in production leads to an increase in demand for resources, so more workers are needed to match that production. This will create more jobs, assuming that we're not just growing because we're more productive. If we're growing because of increased productivity, we may not need more workers because the existing workforce will be doing more. So it's because of automation we can have jobless growth. On the flip side, increased employment can lead to more growth because people have got more money. That leads to higher average household incomes, which leads to increased spending, increased consumption, which boosts aggregate demand and real GDP. Both ways. Growth to inflation. When growth is higher, that is likely to lead to increased inflation because there's more aggregate demand in the economy, and that leads to shortages. Having said that, stronger demand also increases incomes, which pushes up demand pull inflation. Having said that, growth can be due to expanding our productive capacity, and if that's the case, then we can have non-inflationary growth because we can meet supply with any extra demand with increased supply. So it is possible to experience growth without inflation. So generally, the higher the growth, the higher the inflation. So they both go up together. In terms of inflation on growth, it's the opposite. Higher inflation, which would be an up signal, leads to less growth. And that's because higher inflation can reduce business and consumer confidence, so there's less investment spending. There's also higher prices can hurt our international competitiveness, and that can reduce demand for Australian products, leads to net export growth, less employment or more unemployment, less aggregate demand, less real GDP. Always get back to real GDP if it's a growth question. And lastly, employment and inflation. Employment can lead to more inflation. We've talked about this in the last video. It can lead to higher wages, which increases cost push inflation. It can also lead to higher incomes, which increase demand pull inflation. In terms of inflation on employment, higher levels of inflation are bad for employment. High inflation can reduce business and consumer confidence. It can also lead to reduction in international competitiveness, which is all bad for jobs and aggregate demand. Very similar to the impacts on growth. So last thing I want to do in this video is just go through a couple of questions that I've given in the past, and they're in the practice sacs that people have really struggled with. So the hardest questions, essentially. So this question here asks, why is an increase in productive capacity, something you could define, likely to impact on economic growth and the achievement of low inflation? So there's two things you can define there. So I would start with the define of the goal of low inflation. 2 to 3% measured by CPI on average per year over the course of the business cycle. You don't need the per year, just on average over the course of the business cycle is fine. Then, what is an increase in productive capacity? Show you know what the concept means. It occurs when the maximum level of output has increased and we're utilising, so we're able to produce more when all our resources are fully utilised or employed. Ways you can boost your productive capacity through technology, immigration, education. So provide examples of how a country boosts their productive capacity for your first 2 marks. Define the goal, explain what productive capacity is. If you don't feel you're doing that very confidently, at least provide examples of things that can shift that, and that's really just things that boost the PPF or shift the PPF outwards. What are the benefits for the goals then? How does it benefit inflation? How does it benefit growth? It's good for inflation because it helps to alleviate capacity constraints. So that's caused when demand exceeds supply. So we've got like bottlenecks or shortages. And that allows us to meet additional demand without inflated prices. So we're able to meet the increase in demand without causing inflation. And then by keeping prices low, as I said, I really like international competitiveness. Everything gets linked to that pretty much if it's a supply side factor. By keeping prices low, we're able to boost our boosting our productive capacity. That can boost our international competitiveness, and that creates jobs and creates demand in the economy, which will increase production levels as well. So back to the start, define the goal, explain productive capacity, ways to boost productive capacity, benefits for inflation because supply can meet demand, links to growth because we've got lower prices and increased competitiveness. This is a question about this is last year's SAC, explaining using the labour market graph. So you were given a graph and the graph had unemployment going down, but it was still above 5%, and it also had part-time unemployment increasing. And it asks you why the rate of unemployment over the past 2 years may not have contributed to strong wage growth. So in this answer, you get 1 mark for explaining that generally, as a general rule, reductions in unemployment will lead to higher wage growth. So as a general rule, reductions in unemployment signal less spare capacity. Try and use this word as much as you can, spare capacity. There's less spare capacity when there's more employment and less unemployment. So it's a tightening of the labour market. It's generally likely to cause, when demand for demand for labour outweighs supply, this will exert upward pressure on prices of labour. However, over the past couple of years, so this is your current knowledge, the underemployment rate has started to increase, which means that more people are working less hours than they like. This means that the level of unemployment has remained relatively low because businesses have been reducing hours of workers instead, or casualising the labour force, replacing full-time workers with casual workers, and therefore there's less pressure. There's still limited demand for workers. We're just spreading the hours out more. Accordingly, the unemployment rate has become a less meaningful indicator of spare capacity and wage pressures. It's not as useful in staying the level of spare capacity because it's still more spare capacity than the unemployment rate looks like that there is in the economy. This means because wages have gone down, workers have limited bargaining power. Because there's so many of them working less hours, they can easily be sacked still. The easier you are to sack, the less bargaining power you have to raise your wage. And therefore they're able to, and not necessarily sack, but businesses can refuse to give them wage rises and they can resign. They have less power in that case. So sometimes it's hard to sack workers, but it's easier not to give them a pay rise in this context. And that's it. Explain why balanced and steady growth in both aggregate demand and aggregate supply is important for pursuing the goal of low inflation. This is the first question on an exam about 3 years ago. Define the goal of low inflation, a sustained increase in the general level of prices on average over the business cycle. Explain what demand and supply mean. So aggregate demand is the total amount of spending on goods and services. Aggregate supply is total production of goods and services. When aggregate demand grows faster than aggregate supply, the economy may experience shortages or capacity constraints, which may bid prices up or increase prices, which would jeopardise that goal. So therefore, it's important to balance them together. If there's an inadequate growth in aggregate demand, so there's weak aggregate demand, there's likely to be excessive spare capacity as supply outweighs demand, and that could cause lower inflation or deflation as well. So most people in this question would talk about the fact that why it's important to boost supply to meet demand, but it's also important to recognise that it's important to keep demand high so that we don't have excess supply. So growth in aggregate demand is important to make sure that we don't experience deflation or less inflation in the economy as well. Therefore, balanced and steady growth in both of them, so they're going up at a similar rate, around 3 to 4%, which means that we can avoid booms and recessions, because booms are bad because they cause higher prices, recessions are bad because they lead to unemployment, and therefore may achieve more stable economic activity and therefore achieve the goal of low inflation, which is 2 to 3%. It's not 0%. Rates, make sure you know your rates. The ones that people struggle with the most is probably the underemployment rate. It's just underemployed divided by the labour force. Underutilisation includes unemployed and underemployed, so it's always higher. This one's around 15%, this one's around 8%, and the unemployment rate is around 5.5%, 5.6%. So that's why this one's 15%, it's actually around 14% because it's this one plus this one, so it's around 13.5 to 14%. Participation rate, everyone over 15 is in the denominator, even if you're still at school. You just can't be in the numerator if you're still at school. Factors impacting in participation, factors increasing participation, anything that's going to get more people to start looking for work. So raising the pension age means people have to stay and work longer. Childcare subsidies for workers means they'll go back to work quicker after having a child. Compulsory euthanasia, pretty drastic, but we'll have less older citizens that aren't in the labour force, which would be good as well for keeping participation higher. But it would have bad effects because I like my grandma. Factors reducing participation, often decreasing unemployment, would be things like higher school retention rates. Again, as I said to you, that would decrease participation because you can't be part of the labour force if you're still at school, but it could decrease unemployment because you're not unemployed if you're still at school. And youth unemployment's really high when people drop out. Older citizens living longer also decreases participation because they're more likely to retire. Last question, why is productivity growth so important for Australia at the moment, particularly given the fall in commodity prices? So the question was, why is productivity important for living standards, particularly given the fall in commodity prices in the last 5 years? For a question like this, any question on living standards, try and define that. So living standards are defined by the quality of life enjoyed by groups of people. They're made up of material factors, which is dependent on GDP per capita or income levels, as well as other quality of life factors like freedom, leisure time, crime rates, etc. So make sure you define living standards in detail. Falling commodity prices have basically meant we're making less money in the mines. So that's led, because of reduced demand for China, that's led to increased unemployment in the mining industry, lower incomes, lower profits. That's reduced investment spending and hurt a lot of people in that sector. And therefore it's important that we're able to boost productivity and demand in other sectors so we can make up for the fact that the mining sector can't sort of look after us anymore. So productivity, define it, it's the level of output per unit of input and producing goods more efficiently. And it's really important because, again, you go back to the living standards and international competitiveness. When we lower our cost per unit, we can keep prices low. This should help to boost net exports, boost demand and real GDP, create more income. Essentially what it's doing is creating jobs in the other sectors of the economy because we're more productive to make up for all the job losses that have occurred in the mining industry. Even though this has picked up a little bit recently, this question's a little bit old now, but we're trying to create jobs in the other sectors to make up for the lack of work in the mining sector. And to do that, we need to be productive so we can keep prices down to be competitive. That's all.